So after finishing my Clone Trooper backpack, I wanted to coalesce all the videos together into one long format video so that it's a bit easier for people to follow along in the entire process. So let's cover exactly how I made this 3D printed Clone Trooper backpack. So everything starts with a 3D file that we are then going to 3D print. Now the backpack is pretty large and pretty difficult to print in one piece, so I'm going to cut it up into 6 individual pieces in a program called Mesh Mixer. Once we have all those pieces separated, I'm going to start 3D printing them all out, and then we'll need to put them all together. Now for assembly, I like to use some CA glue and an old soldering iron to glue the pieces together and then physically weld them together. Before I lay the glue down, I like to sand each of the edges with some medium grit sandpaper. This helps the glue bond quicker and better. But with the hot soldering iron, I'm actually welding the exterior parts together. It's not a super strong join, but it is definitely quick, so we don't have to wait for that glue to finish drying all the way. Now that we've got the backpack as fully assembled as we can, I want to go over all the seams with this Bondo glazing and spot putty. The stuff has a toothpaste consistency, but over the course of a few hours it will harden, and we'll eventually be able to sand it all smooth. But what it's going to do for us now is plug up any holes that was left from the pieces not perfectly aligning and close any gaps so that the resin that we're going to use doesn't spill out and drip everywhere. Now that the Bondo is fully hardened, we can take our fiberglass resin and begin to coat the inside of the backpack with it. Now looking back, this part is pretty optional. Not sure if I would do it again the second time because it's going to add a bunch of weight to the backpack that might not be entirely necessary if you add a foam lining to the inside like I did, and we'll show you later. But this resin is a 2-part mixture, that brown liquid and then a liquid hardener that just takes a few drips to get things going, but then we'll mix them all together and start pouring it on the inside of the backpack, sloshing it around, trying to cover one whole face of the inside. You'll see that I actually get some tape to tape off the top so that none of it spills out. And you can see I'm wearing a respirator because this stuff smells terribly. It's going to smell terribly for a couple more days. So if you do this, be sure and leave it in a shaded or well-ventilated area. And be careful not to use too much resin because this is an exothermic reaction and it can interfere or start to melt the 3D print itself as it starts to harden. So be careful not to use too much. Now that we've got the entire interior coated with that fiberglass resin, I'm going to take a mouse sander and just top off all of the Bondo that we put in the seams. We don't want all those seams sticking out while we begin fiberglassing the exterior of the backpack now. This is more so to fill in the 3D print lines so that when we go to paint it, it looks smooth and consistent. So you can see here I'm mixing more of that fiberglass resin to apply to one side of the backpack at a time. Wait an hour or two between sides for that resin to fully harden before you start applying another side. But we're going to do all 5 sides and then start sanding some more. Now I'm going to initially hit everything with the mouse sander again using a pretty low grit sandpaper. I'm going to be using around 60 grit because this fiberglass resin is pretty tough stuff. You can see that I'm wearing a respirator because this is going to make a lot of dust and you don't want to be breathing that in. But we're going to be using this mouse sander to get as smooth as we possibly can before we start to move on to hand sanding. So we're going to use that Bondo glazing and spot putty again to fill in any of the pinholes or spots the mouse sander couldn't reach. We're going to let that cure for around 6 hours, and then we should be able to hand sand everything smooth so that we finally have a surface ready for painting. So after sanding down that Bondo and using some high build filler primer to fill in any smaller scratches, we're ready to start painting. And the base coat of paint that we're going to be using is a Rust-Oleum matte white. Be sure and do this in light coats so none of your paint streaks, waiting about 20 minutes in between coats. Once the base coat of paint is down, we're going to be adding our Republic logo. I got this one from Fancy Tuna Graphics on Etsy. It is a 6-inch diameter sticker. So just line it up, peel it off, and do your best to keep it aligned and keep air bubbles out from underneath the sticker. Now I'm going to start working on the foam insert that I use for the backpack. Now the insert itself is going to be made out of EVA foam, so I'm cutting some rough templates out for the shape that I'll need. Using some sheet paper to cut out a rough shape of the sides of the backpack, and then cutting those shapes out in foam. I'll then roughly assemble the sides of the foam using some T push pins and just some hot glue to hold it in place. But I'm going to be using some contact cement later on down the line for a stronger hold. I'll then use a Dremel tool to chamfer off the sides of the foam, kind of round everything off, make it look all nice and neat. Okay, back to the main body of the backpack now, and we're going to start weathering this thing. Now the first thing I'm going to do to weather this is do a black wash. It's a very simple technique where you mix some black acrylic paint with just a little bit of water. That's going to thin it out so that we can brush it directly onto the backpack and then wipe it off with a paper towel. And ideally some black paint is going to be left behind, specifically in the hard creases in the edges of the backpack where dirt and grime would naturally accumulate. I'm going to do this all around the backpack, but paying special attention to those edges and hard creases. After that first coat of weathering, I start to think about how I'm actually going to be wearing this thing. And I think the solution that I came up works pretty well. I'm going to be using these D-rings on all four corners of the backpack and then clipping in some backpack straps that I actually found off of Amazon. So I've got to drill a couple holes through for the D-rings, kind of chipping off the resin on the back side that splintered off. But then we can drill in 2 of those bolts and then reinforce them on the other side with some nuts so that everything stays in place and can actually support a bit of weight. I'm going to be using some more of that fiberglass resin to reinforce the nuts on the inside of the backpack just to make sure that they stay put and to fill in all that splintered resin from before. Now, for the fabric cover of the backpack, I'm actually going to be using some more of that sheet paper to trace out a rough outline of the material that I'll need to cut. For the fabric, I'm using some cotton with a faux leather backing just to help try and waterproof this thing, make sure my stuff inside actually stays a little bit protected. But I'm just going to trace a little bit larger than the sheet paper outline that I have so that I can fold the edges in and then sew them closed so we have a nice clean edge. It was a lot of hand sanding, so use a sewing machine if you've got one. I might actually start to invest in one for when I make more of these. So to make sure that the fabric cover can actually close and stay closed, we're going to be using these 2-part push buttons. You feed one end through the fabric and then connect that to the other side and actually hammer it in. It kind of bends the metal around both sides so you have one side of the snap button all assembled. We'll need to put the other side on the backpack itself. For that, I'll probably use some contact cement and some E6000 because we need that to stay stuck to the backpack. Okay, a few final things before we put all this thing together. Similarly to the black wash, I'm also going to do a light brown wash just to make some different colors. It really makes the weathering seem more complex and more realistic. It's very similar to the black wash, but instead of black paint, we're using a light brown. I'm also going to weather the fabric covering a little bit by just rubbing it in some dirt. Sometimes it really is that simple. Okay, here we are at the end of the project. Let's put everything together now and show off our finished Clone Trooper backpack. Now first, I'm going to just squeeze that foam insert into the backpack. It's a pretty tight fit, but that's what we wanted. That's going to keep all my belongings safe in there and also keep things quiet so I'm not a rattling maraca walking down the street in this thing. Next, we'll clip in the backpack straps to the 4 D-rings in the corners. I might go back and rework these, maybe make some of my own to look a little bit more realistic or in-universe, but I had a deadline for this project, so these worked really great in the meantime. And finally, we'll clip in the 4 snap buttons that I put around the backpack to connect our fabric cover and really bring it all together. So there we go, guys. That is how I made my own Clone Trooper backpack. If you want any additional information on any specific step, look for the individual videos. I was able to focus a bit more on each step in those videos, and they have some extra information. This was a really fun project overall. In fact, I'm actually going to offer finished kits of this, just like this backpack in my shop on galacticarmory.net. So if you want a finished backpack or a DIY kit like the one we started with, be sure and check that out. In the meantime, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that you are building something really cool, and I hope that I see you again in the next video.